Well, we started this series last week talking about the reality that Jesus said you could boil down the entire Old Testament and even all of his teaching to this: love God, love one another, and love your enemy. And the Jesus way would be the way of love, and it would also be the way of freedom. But in the beginning of the movement, and we looked at this last week, right after Jesus was gone and his followers began to gather and try and figure this thing out, some Jewish believers came into the mix. Okay, guys that had been Jews and were now followers of Jesus came into the mix and said, hey, guys, like Jesus was Jewish and all of his disciples were Jewish. And now that we look back on the Old Testament in light of Jesus, we see him all over it. And so we think that anybody that wants to become a Christian should become fully Jewish first. They need to follow all of the Old Testament laws and all of our Jewish rituals and customs. But we saw last week that the leaders of the movement met and they talked about this, and it was a big deal. They talked at length and had some heated discussions about this, and they decided, nope, we aren't going to make people that aren't Jewish become Jewish in order to follow Jesus. This new movement is going to be marked by unprecedented freedom. And so in this series, we're imagining those very first followers of Jesus, what it was like for them in the very, very beginning. Because these new believers now, they didn't have the Old Testament law. They didn't follow it like the Jewish nation had, like the nation of Israel. And there was no New Testament yet. I mean, you think about it, the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote about half of the New Testament, he didn't even start writing anything until about 25 years later. And then it took another 25 years at least for those letters to begin to be circulated widely among the churches. So for the first 50 years of the movement, that's not a lot to go on, right? I mean, they were left with this odd assortment of parables and teachings. Really, they were all they had were the teachings of Jesus that were being passed on by the disciples and by other eyewitnesses. So in this series, what we're doing is we're kind of stepping back in time. And we're asking the question, what would it be like to be a Jesus follower, like those very first followers, if all we had to go on to try to live this out were a few of the teachings of Jesus that were getting passed on? And so for the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at some really core teachings of Jesus about freedom. We're going to look at 5 different things that Jesus wants to free us from, that he taught on very specifically. We're going to look at fear and doubt and worry and judgment and sin. Now, if you're like most people, you look at you think through themes like that, and you might think to yourself, okay, how can I possibly be set free from that kind of stuff? I mean, come on. This is a cute idea, for a series, Jason. But my fears, right, and my worries and my doubts and all of that stuff will always be there. There's nothing you can say or even Jesus can say to really impact that. And I just want to say, man, I get that. I totally do. Because when Jesus first taught on these things, when people were first hearing these things, nobody took him seriously. They were like, you've got to be kidding. During the life and the ministry of Jesus, people were like, what? What are you talking about, man? We can't just not be afraid. We can't just not worry. We can't just not doubt. That's crazy. And honestly, all of that stuff seemed utterly ridiculous until they encountered the risen Jesus. And suddenly, what you see is, just historically what you see is, whether you're a Christian or not, what you see in history is his followers started to understand, and they started to say, oh, okay, we get it now. And they started to embrace these extreme teachings. They actually began to live them. And they discovered a freedom that they never knew existed, they never thought was possible. And so what we're going to think about, the Jesus way, the way of freedom, we're going to think about this. And today we're going to start with the issue of fear. We're going to talk about freedom from fear. Because over and over and over, Jesus would say to anybody that would listen and to anybody that would follow him, he would say, fear not. He would say, don't be afraid. Now, the Gospel of Matthew, uniquely captures the progression of this teaching. So we're going to kind of pick this up in the middle of the teaching. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus gets his followers together, and he gathers the 12, okay, like the first 12s. Okay, just making sure you guys are awake. I mean, come on, man. It's Mother's Day, so. He gathers the 12, right? And he's like, look, we've been together for a while, but we're going to split up into teams of 2. And I'm going to send you guys out in pairs to do a bunch of stuff. And I'm sending you out, he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Okay, you're the sheep, he says. You're the sheep and they're the wolves. And I'm sending you out, and eventually some bad stuff's going to happen to you. You're going to be arrested, you're going to be beaten, you're going to be misunderstood, you're going to be abused. Some of you are going to end up eventually being killed. You're going to sacrifice a great deal for following me. And he says, but don't be afraid. And the disciples, right, imagine you're hearing this, and they're like, what? We're going to be arrested and beaten and abused and some of us eventually killed? But you don't want us to be afraid. Are you serious? And Jesus was like, yeah, I'm serious. You don't have to be afraid. And then he went on to say this. He said, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Now, imagine being one of the 12 and you're trying to get your mind around this. And you're like, wait a minute. Okay, wait a minute, Jesus. Are we supposed to be afraid or not be afraid? And Jesus is like, see, you're afraid of the wrong things. Don't be afraid of what can only hurt your body. And he goes on. He says, okay, guys, let me explain a little bit. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care, and even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Like your Heavenly Father knows everything about you. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. And I'm like, well, okay. So are you saying that you're going to keep bad things from happening to us? Because you just said that we're going to be arrested and beaten and tortured and abused and killed. And then you said that God cares for the sparrows, but then you said they fall to the ground and they die. So what are you saying? But Jesus is wanting them here to connect the dots, because about 2 chapters earlier, not long ago in their lifespan, they had undergone this unforgettable experience. And that experience ties directly into what Jesus is trying to get them to understand here. Now, this is a very famous story, and it's found 2 chapters earlier, Matthew 8. Jesus is surrounded by a crowd. And when you're teaching and healing like that, people like that. And so he's got this massive crowd. And the only way to escape the crowd was to get on a boat. Right? Because anywhere you can walk, they can follow. So the only way to get away is to get on a boat. It's not like Jesus and his posse had 6 tricked out Escalades, right? And they could just climb in and head off. The only way to get away was to get out on the lake. So this is part of why he's always teaching around the lake. When he's had enough, he's like, see ya. So it says, then he, Jesus, got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. And suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. Now, the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by hills. So it's possible for huge storms to roll in almost completely undetected. And so that's what happens. And so here they are on the lake, and the storm is so furious that the waves are actually sweeping over the boat. Now, I want to pause here because I think many of you can relate to an experience like this. Many of you at some point have had an experience that is absolutely terrifying, like where you were afraid for your life. Maybe it was on an airplane, or maybe it was on a boat. or maybe it was in some other venue. But maybe you've had a time in your life where you literally thought you were going to die. It was an experience that came on suddenly and didn't last long. But if you remember back to it, you were scared to death. Now, some of you know I felt this not long ago. I'm not going to get into the whole story because I've told it before. But last year, Jen and I took a little trip to Cabo. And we were in Mexico, and we were snorkeling just off the beach. And as we were snorkeling, we realized we can't get back to the shore. Like suddenly the tide changed and the undertow kicked in, and I honestly thought we were both going to die. So then I started swimming like as hard as I possibly could, and I made it back to shore, and I thought Jen was going to die. Thankfully, there was a kid on the beach that had a boogie board, and there were only like a handful of people on the beach because it's like, what do we do? So I was able to get my hands on this boogie board, and I was able to swim out to her and get her, and we made it. But it was crazy. And some of you know that story. You've heard it before. Now, my point is that many of you have your own story. You've been caught in a sudden life-threatening situation where you were panicking for your life. Okay, so now you have to imagine that's where these guys are. The waves are so huge that they are sweeping over the boat. Now, Matthew, who wrote this in his gospel, was there. He was in the boat, and he tells us that all heck was breaking loose, and he says, but Jesus was sleeping in the boat. Now, how in the world could Jesus be sleeping? Seriously. And I was thinking about this week, and I'm like, that means there was like 2 miracles in this story. But we're talking about Jesus, so I put nothing past him. But I wonder if, and I'm just throwing this out there, I wonder if from Matthew's perspective, like he was asleep, but if Jesus did that thing that people sometimes do, you know what I'm talking about, like where you're pretending to be asleep. And if you have kids, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because we have all done this with our kids, right? Like something's going on in the room, and you're pretending to be asleep. But you're totally listening to the kids and all the pandemonium, and you're like, I don't want to deal with that, you know? And they're just like, shh, mom's sleeping, or, dad's sleeping, but you're totally aware of everything that's going on, right? So, I don't know in this story if Jesus was actually asleep or if he's just pretending to be asleep. But the boat is getting thrashed around, and the disciples are panicking. And they are terrified that they're going to drown. And they look over at Jesus, and he's asleep. Now, here's why that's an incredibly powerful image. Some of you have struggled terribly with your faith because there has been a tragedy or there has been an event or some sort of circumstance in your life, and you prayed and you looked to Jesus, and he was asleep. He did not respond, just like in this boat. He did not respond the way you thought Jesus should. God did not respond the way that you thought God should. And you felt like, well, either God doesn't exist, okay, or God is asleep, or God just doesn't care. And here's what's interesting. All of the disciples, when you look at it, they all had that experience at some point or another. See, the very ones that brought us the message of Jesus, the ones that insisted on him being the Son of God, the ones that laid the whole foundation for what it is that Christians now believe, the ones that insisted that he is the way and the truth and the life, they were no strangers to adversity. And in this particular scene, not only did they imagine that God was asleep, they looked over and they saw God asleep. And so, you know the story. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" To which I'm sure at least one of them thought, permission to speak freely. Are you serious? We're about to drown. So, okay, here's how it works with human beings, Jesus. We were about to drown, and so we were afraid. What do you mean, why are you afraid? What kind of a ridiculous question is that? It says, then he got up, Jesus got up, and rebuked the winds and the waves. What did that look like? He rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And it says, the men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and waves obey him. And the only answer to that question is super. He was a Superman. Now, here's something fascinating. In Mark's account of this, and most scholars believe that Mark got his information from Peter. So when he wrote his gospel, he got his information from Peter because the two of them traveled around extensively later on. And in Mark's version of the same story, he writes this. He says, they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. In other words, like they were afraid of drowning, but after Jesus rebuked the storm, they were like terrified of Jesus. Like they thought the storm was powerful, and then they saw Jesus, and it was like, oh my goodness, who are we in the boat with? And it dawns on them, Jesus is actually more powerful and terrifying than the storm. Now, that event had just happened, okay? It was very recent and in their memory when Jesus later taught, hey, don't be afraid of what can only kill the body. Be afraid of the one that can kill the soul. Now, I don't think Jesus is saying, hey, guys, like, you know how you're afraid of storms and dying? Well, you should be even more afraid of me. Because I just want you to walk around terrified of me. You know, that's not really the picture of Jesus we get elsewhere, right? And it's really not the relationship that Jesus is offering to us. That's not the invitation, an invitation into fear. So I think Jesus is saying something more along the lines of this. There is one so much more powerful than anything on earth. And if you look to him and if you entrust yourself to him, nothing on this earth can ultimately harm you. He is powerful and he is good and he loves you more than you can possibly understand. And your soul for all eternity rests in his care. So you don't have to be afraid. So here they are being sent out now, being sent out two by two. And they hear the words of Jesus and begin to connect the dots. They're like, don't fear the one that can only hurt the body. Don't fear the one, don't fear the thing, don't fear the disease, don't fear the storm, don't fear the circumstance, don't fear the person, don't fear the empire in their case. You don't have to fear the things that can only hurt your body. A few chapters later, Jesus just gets done multiplying the fish and the loaves. And he feeds thousands upon thousands. And this unbelievable miracle happens, and the disciples cannot believe it. And right after the miracle is over, it says, Matthew says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. Now, do you know why Jesus had to make the disciples get into the boat? Because they remember what happened the last time they got in a boat with Jesus, right? Like, get in the boat. Yeah, no, really, get in the boat. And the crowds, right? They're like, no, this is really good. What's happening right here? The crowds are going crazy. Okay, the crowds are like, you just fed everybody. People are starting to get this thing. There's momentum, Jesus. There's momentum in the movement. Let's ride this thing. You're like, get in the boat. Because the crowds are just like, we want Jesus. And they want to make him king. And it's just like, okay, feed us, and heal us, and heal us. And the disciples are like, this is awesome. So Jesus has to make them get into the boat. But this time he doesn't go with them. I don't know if he was like, hey, let's all get in the boat. And they all get in, and he's standing there going, I'll hold it for you. And then they get in. He's like, okay. But he sends them ahead, and he goes back and he dismisses the crowd, and the disciples head out on the lake. And Matthew says, after he had dismissed them, talking about the crowd, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Okay, so the disciples are trying to row to the other side, but they're now rowing right into a headwind and all these waves. Now this time, they're not afraid for their lives. They're just frustrated because they're not getting anywhere. And this is when Peter got the idea to invent a stationary rowing machine. Do you guys know that Peter invented that? So he did. You can look that up. So anyway, they've been rowing all night, right? They've been rowing through the night. They're tired. Their hands are blistered, right? They're soaked as the waves and everything. And it says shortly before dawn, okay? In other words, this has been going on all night long. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Fail. Fail, fail, fail. You losers, you failed again." Like, I'm trying to teach you about fear. Like, did we not just go through this? Because you guys remember, like, there was a storm and I was asleep and you guys were like freaking out, and then like I calmed the storm, and then you were more afraid of me than you were the storm, and here we are again on the lake again, and again you're all freaking out. You fail. Like, guys, once again you were afraid when there was something to be afraid of. So haven't you learned? Are you not paying attention? You're afraid when there's something to be afraid of. And I'm trying to teach you, you don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. But you're not learning the lesson. Now, actually, here's what Jesus says. He sees them afraid, and while he's walking on the sea, he says, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." And the disciples are going, wait a minute. You weren't with us, but apparently you were like watching us the whole time. Yeah, exactly. Exactly, because one day I will not be with you, but see, I'll be watching you. And just as you didn't need to be afraid when I was asleep in the boat, and just as you didn't need to be afraid when I wasn't in the boat with you, you don't need to be afraid even when there is something to be afraid of. So here's the lesson. The lesson is you don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Fear not. He says, fear not, fear not. Don't be afraid. And they're like, but Jesus. And he's like, no, shh, stop it. You don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Now, guys, I mean, if you're like me, you're like, what? But this is what Jesus taught his early followers. So just to like pound this idea into our consciousness, just to try to kind of move this concept from our head to our heart into our soul, what I want us to do is I want us to say this out loud together a few times, okay? But instead of the word you, let's make it personal and change it to I. Okay? I don't have to be afraid when there's something to be afraid of. So let's say that together one time. I don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Okay, let's do that one more time. I even when there's something to be afraid of. That's what Jesus taught about fear. You don't have to be afraid even when there's something to be afraid of. Now here's something that I find really encouraging. They did not learn this lesson. They didn't. Like right up to the very end. And you remember Jesus is arrested, and so what do they all do? Like do they stand by him? Do they stand with him? No. They're terrified and they all run away. Run away, run away. Because if they came for him, maybe they'll come for us. And so they ran away. They did not fear not. They did not fear the one that can only harm the body. They were terrified of the ones that could harm their bodies. And despite all the miracles and all the teaching and all the experiences, when Jesus was arrested, in all that pressure and all that confusion, they were horribly afraid and they all ran away. But here's what's amazing. What you see then is after Jesus was gone, when this new movement exploded, they were fearless. It's like somehow it clicked and they finally got it. Something changed it all. And here's what I think it is that made all the difference. And it was not another lesson. It was not another miracle. It was not another boat ride. It was not another campfire talk. It was this: that they saw their resurrected Savior. And once Jesus rose from the dead, they became fearless. Why? Because the ultimate enemy, death, had been defeated. And when they lost their fear of death, they finally feared not, because they lost their fear of everything that goes with it. Now, more teaching didn't do it, and more miracles didn't do it, but seeing a resurrected Savior changed everything. And that's what this series is all about, because Jesus talked about freedom from different things that at the time seemed ridiculous. Like, who can be set free from fear? Who can actually fear not even when there's something to be afraid of? That's just crazy talk. And yet, the very first followers of Jesus, just look at history, they got this. And this is really hard, I think, for us first world Christians. It's really hard for us because we're expecting everything in this life to go just right now. Right? We do. We have that expectation. God owes it to us. And the idea that somehow I could ever be at peace when everything else is falling apart around me, that's just not something that we believe is even possible. But the first followers of Jesus, they got this. They experienced this. And there are many Jesus followers in parts of our world today, and they get this. And they experience this. And when you finally come to the conclusion and you stake your eternity on the fact that Jesus Christ really died for your sins and was buried and rose from the dead and was seen and has resurrection life and offers to us that resurrection life, your fear of death begins to evaporate. And once you're no longer afraid of that, once you learn, as Jesus said, to not be afraid of the one or the thing that can only hurt the body, but you learn to fear, or maybe more accurately, be in awe of the one that holds your soul, something can then happen on the inside. And what once seemed impossible can actually become a way of life. In the late 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome. How many of you have seen Gladiator? Yeah. Some of those guys, some of you guys were eager. That was... It's all the estrogen in here from this Mother's Day thing, right? Is that what's going on? So if you've seen Gladiator, Marcus Aurelius was a key character, and it turns out Marcus Aurelius is a legit historical figure. And Marcus Aurelius, in the movie, is kind of a hero, but from a Christian standpoint, not so much, because he oversaw what's considered to be the 4th major persecution of Christians. So this is like 165 to 180 AD, okay? And this persecution of Christians was going on. And during that time, there became a famous Roman medical doctor, and his name was Claudius Galenus. And Claudius wrote a whole bunch of things that have been preserved down through antiquity. And in his writings, about a half dozen times, he mentions Christians. Now, Claudius himself was not a Christian, not even close. He just writes about them. So he's looking at this whole movement from a Roman perspective as an outsider. But here's what's interesting about being a doctor in that time period. Okay, because of their beliefs, of like religious beliefs, during the time of Claudius, it was illegal to examine a dead body. So as doctors, they couldn't do that. So once a body was dead, they either buried it or they burned it. But doctors were not allowed to examine dead bodies. So what doctors would do is hang around like in the arenas, like the places where the gladiators were fighting and where Christians were being thrown to the lions, because they could examine dying bodies. How about that? So they would examine dying bodies because they weren't allowed to examine dead bodies. So this famous writer, who apparently examined a lot of dying bodies, examined the bodies of some Christians during the persecutions. Now, this is not 20 years after Jesus, okay? This is about 160 years after Jesus. This is several generations into Christianity now. And Christians are being not just put to death, okay? And you can read up on this. They're being tortured to death. They're going through unspeakable things. And in his writing, this famous Roman doctor referenced Christians in one of his documents. And here's what he said. He said, "For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them every day." For fearlessness of death and the hereafter is something we witness in them every day. He's like, it's amazing. Like, no matter what we put them through or how much pressure we put on them to renounce their faith, and I mean, we are trying to extinguish this ridiculous religious cult. We're trying to wipe out Christianity, but they have a fearlessness of death and the hereafter. And we witness it in them every single day. Now, guys, think about this. It was the fearlessness of Christians that captivated the Roman Empire. Because those who believed in a risen Savior did not fear death. And they did not fear those that could only kill the body. Like what we see historically in the movement of Jesus is this: freedom from fear is actually possible. People in the most extreme circumstances have actually experienced it. And this isn't just like a historical mystery. It still happens all around the world, and you do not have to be in a third world country to experience it. People are experiencing this around us all the time. A few weeks ago, when I was on the men's retreat, I was talking to one of the guys there, Jim Kinchy, and we were talking about his faith and a lot of questions that he has. And he's a guy who is more and more attracted to Jesus, but at the same time, there's stuff I don't understand. And I'm like, awesome, let's talk about that. But he shared with me this powerful experience that he had a few years ago when his mom was at the end of her life. And his mom was a person who had a lot of faith. And the beautiful thing to him and the powerful thing to him was watching her faith kick in at the very end of her life. And it was a very powerful, very emotional conversation that we had. But I was like, that ties so much into what we're talking about today. So I asked Jim if he would allow me to interview him and try to kind of recapture that and share some of that with you guys. So Jen and I met him here yesterday, and I interviewed him. And Emily, I sat right where you're sitting. And I interviewed Jim, and I just want to share with you guys what he had to say about this, because I think it's pretty doggone cool. So you and I were at the men's retreat together a couple weeks ago, and we went for a walk, and you were talking with me about we were talking together about a whole bunch of things, but you shared with me an experience that you had with your mom at the end of her life that was really meaningful for you. So would you be willing to kind of retell that story?
Sure. So let me start with, she was super active, 86-year-old lady, volunteered for everything, knew everybody in Bellevue, and she had a fire in her house. I was called at work by the hospital. They said, your mom's in the hospital, she's had a fire, there was a fire, please come. So I went immediately to the hospital. At the hospital, she was super alert, super happy. I asked her, what happened, Mom? She said, oh, I had a little fire. And pretty soon there, the nurse or doctor pulled me aside and told me that it was quite likely she'd had a heart attack based on her blood test. So we learned later that she did have a heart attack and the fire and some pretty significant burns on her shoulders, a few on her head. So she was in the hospital, really trying to get better. Towards the end of 6 weeks is when we started. She was getting more and more tired, but she started to even hint or tell us, and she couldn't talk because of the breathing tube, but she had a whiteboard she could write on, or she would mouth words, things like, I want to die. So I think my older sister heard it first and just was, horrible for my sister to hear that from her mom, who was so active a month before and so healthy, we thought. Turns out her heart was probably not in great shape. We get to Thursday, which was only 2 days before she passed, and she was serious this time. I slept that night at the hotel, woke up, and she just said, Jim, mouthing it, I want to die, I need to die, and it was horrible. So I told her, Mom, can I have a second? Can I call Sally, who's my older sister? She said no. She was this serious that it's like time to go. I'm done. I need to leave this earth. I said to her again, can I just call Sally? I think she's on the way. She agreed. Okay. So I went out of the room and I called all my siblings. So I have an older sister, Sally, younger sister, Ann, and my older brother, Charlie, cousin Cheryl, who is like a daughter to my mom. Called all of them, told them what happened. All of them knew that my mom had been talking like this, but I told them she's serious. We're done here. So my sister Ann lives in Washington, D.C., actually was going through breast cancer at the time. She was on chemo, so she had not come out. We were thinking our mom was getting better. She had written a letter to my mom, though, and I didn't even know about this letter, but kind of a thank you, Mom, goodbye letter. So I came back into the room and I said, Mom, Ann has something she wants to say to you. And I held the phone to my mom's ear. Well, Ann read this letter. And my mom had this biggest smile on her face, hearing these beautiful words from my little sister. Just really summed up everything that my mom is and was, which was a super strong, smart lady who taught us to be very independent kids and smart and to do great things on our own. So she read this letter. At the end of the letter, my sister Ann and I had talked, and we said, let's ask Mom. We're going to respect her wishes. If she wants to go today, that's fine. But my sister would have loved to see her one more time. So at the end of the letter, Ann just said, Mom, I'm booked on a flight tonight. If you can wait for me, I'd appreciate it. And I told my Mom, don't worry. That we've talked to the doctors. You can be asleep if you want, and we'll be here. There will be no pain. They'll give you as much medication as is needed, and Ann understands that. She knows you may not be awake when she gets here. So my mom heard that and just said, okay, yeah, I'm in. That would be great. I would love to see Ann. Immediately after we had that conversation, this sense of peace just washed over my mom. She was a woman of great faith, went to church and was very active in her church in Bellevue. I know part of the relief was that the pain will be over, but we also know that she knew she was going home, and she talked about that a lot. And we talked about that before this horrible week with her in the hospital. people would come into the room, the nurses or doctors or other friends who maybe hadn't seen her and didn't know, that it was coming this close to the end, would come and visit. And they were, to a T, always, everybody shocked. Like, wow, she seems so happy. Like, are you sure she wants to die? Yeah, she was adamant, but she was so at peace.
And you mentioned, when we were talking about this, a few weeks ago, you mentioned it's having a profound impact on your brother-in-law,
Mm-hmm.
who's not not real active with his faith.
No.
But
Mm-hmm.
and yet he was really impacted by this.
Yeah. What happened there was, this was right after my mom passed away, literally her last breath, and we just were all sobbing in the room. No one wanted to say anything. But at some point we had to leave the room and leave my mom. So we did. We walked, and they were escorting us to a little conference room to just grieve for a while. The door to the conference room closed, and my brother-in-law, Johnny, who is not religious at all, and I've never really talked to him about it, but I don't know where his level of faith stands now. But at the time, he kind of broke the ice in that everyone's just kind of silent and crying. And I think he just put his head on the table and he said, "Guys, that was insane. I'm rethinking things here." Were the words he used. And we're like, what are you talking about, Johnny? He's like, that was amazing. What Ruth, that was what he called her, his mother-in-law, the strength that Ruth had through that, and I'm not just talking today, I'm talking the whole getting better, was just amazing. But her in that room, what I saw was this lady who was just happy, in pain, but at peace and happy. And he may not have used so many words, but I think what he meant was he saw her faith, and it's like he was jealous. He really may have even used that term, like, I can't believe what I just saw. Like, that was amazing. Her level of faith, and her level of faith brought her through so much pain, and she had no worries. Everything was good.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, Jim. When I first thought of asking him to do this, it didn't occur to me that it would be Mother's Day, but it is, and so even more appropriate but difficult at the same time, but awesome. And it's amazing what true faith does, and the way that it affects what we're afraid of. I've kind of had, and many of us have had experiences where we're dealing with fear, and it's just ridiculous. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're afraid of something and you go, it's ridiculous to be afraid of this, but I can't stop. I can't stop being afraid. Several years ago, I was in my early 20s, and a woman that was... What? It's like 3 years ago. Jeez, you guys. When I was in my early 20s, many years ago, the woman that was real influential in me coming to Jesus said, "Hey, I need you to go to a place. I want you to go to Malibu, kind of this youth retreat center for Young Life. You have to go there." And I was like, "Why?" And she's like, "It's just, you have to go. It's beautiful. You have to go." And so she's like, "I'll pay for you to go." And it was like, I don't know, it was like $800 or something that she forked out for me to go to this place. And when we got up there, I was having a great experience, and it is just breathtakingly beautiful. And she came to me before the last day, and she said, "Hey, I just want you to know I signed you up for something." And I was like, "Okay." She said, I signed you up to go on the high ropes course." I was like, "What?" She was like, "Yeah." I said, "So you're going with me?" And she's like, "Oh, heck no. But I'll watch." And so I was like, "Oh my gosh." So I have a little bit of a fear of heights. And so I was like, but I got to do this. So I strapped on the harness, and I was like, I'm gonna be a good sport about this. You forked out like $800 for me to be here. You want me to do this? I'll do this. So I go up on this thing, and I'm, it's just it doesn't. Have you ever noticed it's a lot higher when you get up there? So I'm up there, and I've got the harness on and everything. And at first, you're just sort of walking on stuff that's fairly stable, but you're up high. But then you get to this part where there's a rope that just sort of dangles down like this. And you're supposed to walk across this rope. But, I don't have the balance. There's no way I could do that. So the only way you can do it is they have a cable that runs across that's fairly taut. And the only way you can do it is you have to lean out and catch that cable. And then you can kind of shimmy across and the rope will stay stable enough. So I'm like, there's a line of people, right? And there's this guy behind me that's like super Young Life guy. And he's like tiptoeing across the high ropes course. So I'm in front of him and I'm leaning out on this thing and I'm trying to shimmy along and the nerves are kicking in. You've ever had this happen? And I'm just like, so I'm trying to go across this thing. It takes me forever. And the guy's just like, come on, man. So you get to the end and you kind of climb and you get to the highest point of this thing. And the way it ends is you're standing on a platform. And the way you get down is you have to jump off the platform and they have a bar up there and you have to catch the bar. That's what everybody wants to know, man. Did you catch the bar? Are you going to catch the bar? So I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm standing on this platform and the rope that is connected to my harness, it goes over this, deal and then goes down and there's a really big dude at the bottom and he's holding this and I'm looking at him and he doesn't look that big to me from like 50 feet up. And there's just something in me. I'm like, I can't do it. And the guy behind me is like, come on, man, you got this. He'll catch you. This is no problem. You can do this. You've got this. You can totally, you got it. So finally, I'm like, okay. So through all the shaking, I'm like, and I jumped up and I caught the bar. So I'm like, well, what do I do now? And they're like, let go. Let go. I'm hanging there. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're like, let go. And he'll just lower you. I'm like, okay. So I let go of the bar and, kind of just lower down. So I get down to the ground and this guy behind me, now it's his turn. So he's standing on the platform and he lets out like a primal scream and he jumps up as high as he can like Jordan. He does a 360 and catches the bar. And then he's like got one hand and he's swinging back and forth. He's like, yeah. I'm just like, you are kidding me. So I've been thinking about that for just a couple years. And I'm like, am I the biggest wuss on the planet? And I have concluded I'm not. And so here's my thinking about it. You know why that guy wasn't afraid? Because he was like Joe Young Life guy, and he had been on that high ropes course more times than he could possibly count. He had walked across that thing over and over and over. He had made that jump so many times that there was absolutely no fear. He knew the harness would hold. He knew the guy at the bottom was big enough because he had done this over and over. And so I've been thinking about that and thinking, you know what Jesus could say to his followers 2,000 years ago? And why he can whisper through the centuries to you now? Like in spite of whatever you're facing, in spite of whatever you're dealing with, in spite of the terror that may grip you because of some circumstance you just found out about, do you know why he can say to you, don't be afraid? Because he knows how to climb. Because he's spent a whole lot of time on this course. And because he's already made the jump ahead of you. And now he can say with 100% confidence, you don't have to be afraid. Like even though there's something to be afraid of, you don't have to be afraid because I am with you. You don't need to fear anyone. You don't need to fear anything that can only harm the body. Because you've been invited to surrender yourself and your fears to a God who loves you and is with you, who's not surprised by anything that happens to you, and he will walk with you through it. And if you hear that and you go, that just feels like pie in the sky, and a nice story to try to comfort me, just want to say, remember this. Jesus punctuated this invitation to not be afraid, not just with another miracle, but with his own resurrection. I have conquered death, and so now as my follower, he's saying, you do not have to be afraid of what I have already conquered. Because Jesus has been there and done that, and he's standing beside you saying, you got this, you can do this, you don't have to be afraid. And for those of you who have put your faith in Jesus, Jesus says, look, you don't have to be afraid even when there is something to be afraid of. And so here's how I want us to end this morning. I just want to ask everyone to close your eyes for a second. I want you to close your eyes, and I want to bring to your mind and ask you to think about what it is that you really fear most right now. For some of you, it's losing a child. For some of you, it's financial. For some of you, it's marriage. For some of you, it's health. For some of you, it is the health of someone that you deeply love. But what is it you fear most? What is it that just like wakes you up in the middle of the night? What is it that terrifies you? What is that for you? What is it that you most fear right now? And I just want to say to you on behalf of your Savior, and these are the words of Jesus to you. Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Don't be afraid. I am with you. You do not have to be afraid because I am with you. You do not have to be afraid even when there is something to be afraid of.